Welcome everyone. This is the first event of Cultural IP Month. We're really happy to have you here, and we're excited for the panel today to kind of dive into the theme this year and every year, which is cultural IP rights are human rights. So my name is Ruth MacGilp. I've worked in sustainable fashion for around a decade now, and I'm currently a fashion campaigns manager at Action Speaks Louder. I've been familiar with Cypri's work for a while, and I'm really excited to introduce you to the panelists today. So, Cultural IP Month, it's a month of amplifying and raising awareness of the cultural intellectual property rights of Indigenous people, of ethnic groups and local communities. And there's various events throughout the month that you'll be able to join and get involved with. You can see on the screen now the hashtag cultural IP rights are human rights. So if you'd like to talk about this event on social media and the theme and share your thoughts, that would be wonderful. And do make sure to check out the website for different events throughout the month. So first, I'm going to introduce the panel, and then we'll move on to the panel discussion. And then there'll be a chance for a Q&A at the end. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to use the chat box on Zoom. As I said, we're recording this. It will be available afterwards. So let's get started. So I'd love for each of the panelists to give a little introduction to themselves. I'll start with you, Monica.
Thank you, Ruth. My name is Monica. I'm the founder of the Cultural Intellectual Property Rights Initiative, and it's an amazing moment to be here today, almost 5 years after the initiative was launched. 5 years ago, it started a little bit like a dream, almost an impossible idea, and I gave myself a 5-year deadline, and I said, if in 5 years we don't get anywhere with this work, I'll have to stop. But here we are, and we're growing stronger, and there's definitely no idea of stopping anyone soon. Like we call cultural IP rights are human rights is the theme of the decade, because this is definitely a long-term mission and a long-term action plan that needs to be enacted. Thank you very much for being together with us today.
Thank you, Monica. Anna, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello everybody. It's an absolute honor to be part of this conversation. I'm the country director for Ashoka Romania, and we've been working close to, with Monica and the team from Cypri for a few years now, and it's been a really eye-opening experience. And I cannot wait to see where the conversation today is going to lead us, and not only today, but in the future as well. So thank you so much for including us.
Thanks, Anna. It's great to have you here. And finally, Bandana, it'd be great to hear a little bit about you and your work.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me, Monica. Always grateful. I'm a sustainability activist. I'm a lifestyle journalist. I have pivoted from mainstream fashion to sustainable fashion. And it's such an interesting conversation to be part of, because just to give you, I've just returned from India after Dior did a huge global fashion show in Bombay at the gateway of India, which was very craft focused. So I feel this is an important time to talk about what does it mean when such big legacy brands come to, heritage countries and use the skills and what is pertinent, what is kind, and of course relates back to the topic of human rights. So I'm very grateful to be part of this amazing group of ladies. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And yeah, welcome to everyone who has now joined. Today, we're going to be talking about weaving the threads of system change. And basically, we're going to be exploring different areas of this theme of cultural IP rights or human rights, and also weaving in the rights of nature as well, because it's all interconnected. So first of all, Monica, I would love to to ask you to get us started a little bit for anyone new to this concept. So can you define cultural IP rights and why this concept matters, why it's important to you in your work?
It's not easy to define the rights because we are also, let's say, not in a position to define the rights. It is, as a concept, a new generation of rights in the context of the existing legal system. These are collective custodianship rights by nature, and it is the right of indigenous peoples, ethnic groups, and local communities to define them per se. What is different in this approach is that, for example, the intellectual property system as we know it is centered on the idea of private property, whilst custodianship is different than property. It's not about owning something. It's about taking care of something, transmitting it to future generations, keeping it alive. It has a communal interest at its core and not an individual interest at its core. This kind of mind shift revolution, of changing the way we think, is something that we have to start integrating in all the systems, in the legal system, in the fashion system, in the education system, in the social system, and the way how we interact with each other. This is why this is such a big issue of systems change, of changing systems. And at the end, cultural intellectual property rights is about a bundle of different rights, different practices. It's not just a simple normative paradigm where we look at the laws of a country and we say we have a constitution that is superior to different laws, we have different regulations, we have it's about designing a system of practices, a system of relating with each other, and respecting the worldviews and the knowledge systems that are nurtured and sustained in different forms of social living. So I'm not going to call them tribes or local communities. There's different ways of calling them, but basically this idea of the law comes from somewhere external, can be changed. And we have to look at the people who are living closest to nature, who are the first responders to the climate crisis, who are connected with textiles in a way that it's expressing their identity. This is how intimate the starting point for defining cultural intellectual property rights is.
Thank you. That is a really good background. And I know it's not easy to define, but just to kind of set the scene today. And then just another question for you, Monica. Obviously, we're now at the start of Cultural IP Month. So reflecting on the theme, can you explain, just from your perspective, how you would relate cultural IP rights with human rights and why they should be considered as human rights?
In our practice, and for over almost 5 years now, we've seen a lot. When we talk about cultural intellectual property rights, people start thinking immediately and comparing it to the intellectual property system. And this is something that we actually wanted at the start, because we had to start the conversation somewhere in a place that is tangible. And we started it really from examples in the fashion ecosystem, right? We started with examples where intellectual property rights or tools such as copyright and trademarks were clearly inadequate and created a negative or maybe a loss both of culture and of benefit for communities when fashion brands would put their trademarks and then their brand names on creations that were born in communities. So we looked at that paradox. So that was the way conversation started. But now people are still thinking we have to place the conversation in an intellectual property rights system. And they say, but it's difficult to talk about cultural intellectual property rights. Who will own the right? So it's always coming back to this idea of ownership. And this is not what communities are about. So how do we place a discussion in the space of custodianship? When we think of custodianship, we think about a relationship with the environment, and then it's people it's animals, it's the nature itself. And this is where you come to see it is about human rights, because in many places in this world, there's people who are dying to defend their lands. There's people who are fighting very big systemic inequalities. So this fight for safeguarding biocultural diversity at the end, so both cultural diversity, cultural identity, and biological diversity is so much, it's an issue of respecting human rights. And if we want to, let's say, simplify the conversation, cultural intellectual property rights and cultural sustainability is about deploying a human rights-based approach. And that's what we try to bring also to our audience, this idea that human rights and cultural IP rights are the same. It's the same starting point. So we're not in a, let's say, private property space. We are in a collective space where both human rights and this new generation of rights coexist.
Yeah, I've always really appreciated how you frame the conversation with a lot of nuance, because I think in fashion, and also in like the sustainable fashion mainstream conversation, we like to think of human rights and environmental rights as totally separate. We like to think of design as a separate discipline to sustainability, and there's not a lot of integration between the different impacts that fashion has. So yeah, I think it's a really great place to start, just for everyone who's in this panel and going forward into your work, to just to think about those interconnections, those cultural IP rights and human rights being one and the same, and this not being a sort of niche conversation on the side of everything else. So thank you so much for explaining that to me and to everyone else. So I'm going to move on to you, Bandana. I'd love to ask you a little bit about your experiences working in, as you said, mainstream fashion and sustainable fashion, and what you found is missing from that mainstream conversation in terms of honoring cultural heritage, collaborating with custodians of traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions. What have you found in your journey in fashion are the missing links there?
Thank you so much for the question. I sort of reached this path to being, the sustainability path through media as a writer. And, as a writer in mainstream fashion, the biggest problem was this absolute disassociation in the system of production, creation, production. There was no continuity. We only saw the product. So when I pivoted to become an activist in my media space, it was very important to go and do stories where you go to the source. When you go to the source of these stories, there you see what you're talking about: human rights, custodianship, people at the frontier of climate crisis. To give you an example, just a few months back, I was in Ladakh, the Tibetan plateau, and I'm going there to do a story on one of the most prized wools in the world, the most expensive, the pashmina. So I'm there with the nomads, 18,000 feet above sea level, in the most extraordinary, extremely fragile environment, where you see the nomads living in nature, living with nature. And all they do is they're shearing the wool off the neck of the goat. When they're shedding it naturally, as the temperature warm up, then they start shedding the wool that actually keeps them really warm during very brutal winter. And the women, when they're combing out their hair, they're singing hymns that are saying, thank you for the grass that you have eaten, thank you for the wool that you have given. It's like this little hymn that they sing. They are the most frugal people living on this planet, and yet they are at the mercy of climate crisis. Like they are the first people who are going to be hit by any change in the environment. And that wool then goes all over the world to become the great pashmina shawls and the pashmina jackets that are made by every legacy brand that you can think of, sold for thousands and thousands of dollars. When you look at their lives, and trust me, they're not grudgingly doing this. They are nomads, but it's a challenging life. And then you look at who's representing them. Who is their voice? Because they're nomadic folks, and they are part of the fashion system. They are the ones who are collecting the wool that go all over the world to make priceless items of fashion. Oh, I mean, I don't know. I don't come from a space where I can make any sense of policy, or I'm just a storyteller. But for me to be able to then go behind the scenes and talk about these stories, and thank God today there are magazines and there are platforms where they want to give you the space to say, this is the origin story of your fabulous shawl. And I hope that people perk up to, the idea that a product is not the end all and be all. There's an entire system behind it. So for me, that has been extraordinary change in the way I look at storytelling, in my activism, in the way I get vocal about who needs to be represented most. They're the ones who are probably the ones with the least carbon footprint in this world.
I think that's really interesting to hear that increasingly, the media are more interested in these stories, because obviously traditionally it's all been about that, the cult of the individual designer or creative director, them being the face of that product or that brand. But as we all know, there are dozens of pairs of hands throughout the fashion supply chain, even for the most basic of garments, that is invisible. And we sort of view fashion these days as product. But as we know, it's so much more than that. It's the process behind it, which is so beautiful. And we need storytellers like you to really bring that out, because it's so often viewed as just manufacturing. But there's so much culture involved in that too. So thank you for giving that really beautiful example. I was wondering in your work if there's anything that stands out in terms of regenerative practices in fashion, in textiles, in jewelry, or any other kind of field that you've worked in, where that kind of local community culture links up with regenerating nature. You gave a good example there, but I'm wondering if we can kind of illustrate any more practices where sort of cultural IP rights and the rights of nature do intertwine.
Well, unfortunately, in our global south, regenerative practices, research and development into all kinds of innovative fabrics and what have you, is slower than, let's say, Scandinavian countries. And you can see why, because, a country like India, for instance, is like 1.2 billion people. Indonesia, I live in Bali, it's an incredibly large population. And so the priorities of innovation somehow sort of dissipates in the larger thing of making sure people have food in their mouth, or in their belly, and a roof over their head. And so I feel that the practices where I see designers sort of engage in a more holistic manner are the younger designers who are craft-led designers. So for them, it's an immersive, creative process where they will go and live with the community. They will understand their life 360 degree, why they do the things that do, the old practices, and understand that, and then create around that narrative that exists, that's authentic. Big brands, they don't. They can research on an academic level, they can do curatorial work that looks really fancy, but that level of immersion is really, my hope is only with the younger, smaller designers who are able to control what they produce, control the narrative, control the kind of systems that they can put into place that doesn't harm the environment and the people, and also show respect to the collaborators, the co-creators, the embroiderers, the weavers. So at the big brands, I don't even know where they're going to start, because they just grew so exponentially, so huge that they don't know how to rein in anymore. So my activism leads me to upcoming younger designers, because that is where we're telling them, okay, you can make those changes. You can grow those sustainable practices along with the growth of your business. I find that's the most hopeful part. For the bigger brands, the government needs to intervene. For innovative practices, for regenerative practices, we need policy changes. But where I come from, it is, the big brands are a handful. We can literally name them in, two hands. But imagine the majority of them being smaller, younger brands. So my focus is to see that they understand the journey that they need to get into, because you can't do business on a dead planet.
Absolutely. I think it kind of links back to the whole problem of so-called fast fashion, because if we want to engage in a meaningful way within supply chains beyond that kind of transactional exchange, it is going to take time. And, these designers are going to take several months or even years to develop those relationships. And that just doesn't fit into, the super fast, efficient system of production that these big brands have. Do you have any examples of designers that you've reported on or that you've met who are kind of leading the way, and maybe like what can big brands learn from that?
Well, big brands can certainly learn not to make so much stuff that they have to dispose, burn, cut them up and stuff pillows with, because that's what they're doing with couture stuff. You can't sell it in the market for less money. And they say that when you're sitting on a plane, it's likely that you're sitting, with a stuffed couture dress on your seat. That's hilarious and obnoxious. For me, any brand, there's so many young brands that are so intrinsically related to communities and craft. And the reason why big brands today, like Dior had the show I was just telling you earlier, which is like collaborating with Chanakya School, which works with young girls who are from marginalized families. And, in India, most of the crafts are actually passed down from father to son. And so these women are being educated to do this generational, intergenerational work. And so I can see the focus being on craft. And it is important, whatever, maybe it's just the optics, but sometimes the optics regenerates this sort of, unfortunately, in the fashion world, these optics generate a sense of value, however authentic they may or may not be. I'm more like, get with the program. At this moment, we have no time to gauge who's authentic and who's not. I was like, you want to deal with craft, do it the right way. And we see that. And I think the younger brands, there's so many in India, nor black nor white, 11. Amongst the younger ones, there's so many. Anna Villa. We just had Fashion Week in India, and you could see we had a whole day of sustainable. It was called the Sustainability Day. Which is unfortunate because it shouldn't just be a day, but to see young designers come up front and have an entire system worked out. They're so careful about the supply chain, the value chain. And I'm like, they've got it right. We've got to keep pushing. And I think the big designers look at them now going, we've got to make those changes. So they're doing it with capsule collections now. So they can't change the whole system. So they'll do a capsule collection that follows the system of a young, sustainable brand, or rather a brand that has sustainable practices, but it's just a capsule brand. It's a capsule collection. So it's a bit of greenwashing happening with the big brands. But I know that all eyes are on these younger designers who are so truthfully doing their business. And I think the big brands are quite scared, in all honesty. Like, how do you get away with it now? In which world would you get away bastardizing the universe like this?
I really love that idea that the solutions actually do exist on these small scale levels. It's not about reinventing the wheel necessarily. It's just about scaling that up to more systemic change, which brings me on to Anna, because I know your work is in the sort of systems change field. And I think we talk a lot in the fashion industry about the fashion system being this kind of all-consuming thing, umbrella under which we all operate. I just wanted to ask you whether you could define systems change sort of in a beginner's way for us, and how this relates to the concept of cultural intellectual property rights that Monica and her team have been pushing for.
Well, thank you for the question, and it's quite a complex one, so I'll try to the best of my ability, but trust me, probably we'll find together better definitions. I would say that the normal behavior today is to react after the fact. So that's when a lot of people get incentivized to shout at something that already happened. So to punish, in a way, misbehaviors. But also as people, we have a limited capacity of always shouting. I mean, there are so many problems in the world and so many competing pains in a way that you're like, what do I do now? For what do I shut out now? And systems change is actually when we no longer think of problem and solution like a linear thing, but we are actually tackling what are the fundamental root causes that create the environment that enables this series of problems that then we're trying to solve. So it's actually going way deeper. And I would even say that cultural IP rights is more than just human rights. It's actually the humanity story and connecting us back to humanity in general. I mean, when I said it was eye-opening working with Monica, besides the complexity of the systems, actually, because there are multiple systems that you guys are operating in, was just, for example, reconnecting as a human to the stories that are then manifested on textiles, right? We can see actually birds disappearing from a textile depending on the period of time, but it used to be there. And what does that say about us on this planet as humans, as an entire footprint beyond fashion and beyond what we consume? It goes back to what we put value on. And I think value on is reconnecting us to our vulnerable and authentic humanity, which, yeah, we're people, we're not always nice. So we need to go through that vulnerability process of accepting that sometimes we are also part of the problem. So if we still buy and if we still continue to carry on narratives that allow for this to happen, for this environment to happen, then we are also contributing to the problem. And when discovering your work and Monica's work in particular, I was absolutely know that it's not just about protecting, which is usually make sure that that thing stays like in a museum, you know, like don't touch it, recognize it, give it credit, but that's it. It's actually more than that. It's how you can actually bring it into future decision making, again, for humanity, because that's our prime raison d'etre, right? We want to make the world a better place for us to live. We're a very selfish species. So that was something that I found extremely juicy and interesting. How can we actually take it further than just protecting it and looking at it like in a capsule, right? But how can we bring those practices, those philosophies, those values into future decision making? And I think this is where we need translators like you guys, and a lot of storytelling and a lot of conversations between normal people that need to be more present. I mean, when you meet with your friends, just talk about this, perpetuate these stories and the role for the future as well, not only for the past, and the justice on history. Because what happened. It's how can we move forward, and how can that have an amplified impact, and become translators for and voices for people, and don't be afraid, because I think sometimes we're too afraid of not being politically correct enough or not knowing enough. I think if we do come with vulnerability and say, this is our intent and these are the values and principles we believe in, but we don't have all the solutions, we can come up with meaningful conversations that then revolutionize in a way. It's beyond ethical consumption field. It's literally how do we want to design our lives and take decisions in the future about what's important. Mm-hmm. So yeah, deeply in awe of the resilience you guys have. So
that was a really, really interesting answer. I love the idea that it's not just about protecting and as Monica was saying, that's really the framework of traditional intellectual property and ownership and protection. And what I love about the conversations that happen in this community is that it's so beyond that paradigm of just cultural appropriation that we see in the fashion industry, which is very, there's not a lot of nuance in that conversation. And what you're saying is that textiles and craft and any type of cultural expression is alive. It's not something just to be preserved and kept. It's something to be shared and evolved as we grow as well. So I think that's just a really beautiful framing for this conversation going forward throughout the month as well. So thank you so much for that. Another question I had for you after looking through the work of Ashoka is the organization uses this word of change makers, and I'm quite interested on how you define that, how you encourage people to become change makers, and like you were saying, for people to be translators or mediators or storytellers of these wider issues in the world. What would you say to people that want to make that impact, that want to be change makers, and how would you relate that back to this concept of systems change?
It's actually a very simple rule: nothing for me without me. So we really need to, and it happens in all fields. When we think we know better what you need, and we come and tell you that these skills are the skills you need to have, and this is what you need to do, and this is the pathway to success, because we have this very dominant culture, a little bit colonial perspective on systemic work and how to empower people. God, I hate that word. So change making for us is actually creating the conditions, which takes time, and it's a process in which people regain agency, and regain agency in a way that it's authentic to them, not particularly what you want out of them, but in a way that they reconnected, I would say, to restored dignity, and they have a clearer understanding of what they can actually influence and do, and they can choose for themselves how they want to go about it. We say there are 4 ingredients to change making, as to give it a bit of a denser definition, but in reality, it's a bit more fluid and more nuanced. But it goes like this. First of all is cognitive empathy. So not pity, not charity. It's really being able to sit uncomfortably sometimes with the person next to you and allow them to be themselves. Second is working in fluid teams of teams. And if you can only look at the names in this panel, I'm like, we're from all over the world. We can connect the dots in a way that was unimaginable years ago. I mean, technology moves so fast and we can find each other. The idea is how to find each other faster and work together without being afraid of normal, traditional roads to impact, you know? Third and fourth thing is always considering others. So this is kind of the new leadership we're talking about, which is much more collective. And nothing that you do should serve your own individual single interests. You should take into account other people. And the first one is actually change making in itself, is the agency to take action once you know what are your options. I love this combination, and I think we'll always have to be like this, of even policymakers, you know, going visiting grassroots organizations, because a lot gets lost in the process and we all become numbers in an Excel sheet or market share pies and so on. So I really think that these experts of holding processes actually are very, very needed. And if it's a skill of the future, we will need much more facilitators, art of hosting conversation, art of asking the right questions, so that we can enable this new wave of living in the end and deciding and designing together in all aspects of life. But yeah, nothing for me without me. Stop treating people as beneficiaries. That would be the first thing that I would shout out of my lungs. So yeah.
That's really wonderful. Thank you so much. It's I think when we see, I mean, for me, when I see words like systems change, and it's quite hard to kind of have the tangibility of what that means. But when you frame it as we're all, people within this community relating to one another, it makes it a lot more imaginable how we might begin to make that change. So thank you so much for that. I have one more question for you, Monica, and then I'll move on to my sort of final takeaways for each of you, from each of you. And it kind of relates to this idea that you just raised, Anna, of even kind of on a policy level, on an institutional level, getting back to basics. Because Monica, I know that you were recently at the biodiversity COP, and I've been thinking a lot about how these kind of institutions, these big systemic organizations like the UN and the COPs, how we bring these, some might say, more radical ways of organizing and thinking to these big institutional frameworks. And from your perspective, like, how do you advocate for this nuanced concept of cultural IP rights within those kind of existing institutions?
Thank you for this question, Ruth. And it really ties into, I had some reflection as Anna was speaking, and I was thinking the theory of change making and how we apply that in practice. And it's also connected very much to how we then reach out to the UN bodies, to these different overarching conventions that look at the issue and looking at this issue holistically. Because as we said, always, like, the threads that we're weaving in this conversation today, there are 4 different threads at least. It's fashion, law, intangible cultural heritage, biodiversity. And as we keep weaving, we see that there's multiple, let's say, ends that again meet, and it becomes a beautiful structure. One of the tools we created to give agency, to give reparation, to give dignity, and create that space for that these new ways of thinking to develop, and these new connections to form, was the 3 C's rule, and is the 3 C's rule. Consent, credit, compensation is not a bottom-down approach. It's not a framework that is imposed. It's just a space for dialogue. It's a space for dialogue where stakeholders with different worldviews, both the stakeholders that still believe today that it's to them to tell other people what to do, and people who are fighting and advocating to have their space to decide, to self-govern, to share their customary practices, their protocols, and say how they want to be treated, is a place for having that dialogue. We say we are a mediator, and when we say we are a mediator, we're not mediating, not brokering businesses in that sense, right? We're not, we're trying to bring everyone into this conversation, a conversation that needs, it's imperative for whatever we define empowerment, to have legal literacy at its basis, because laws and regulations and agreements, and even if we say just agreements, they are the basis of the social construct and the way we relate. And agreements are there in traditional governing systems. They are agreements. They are taken together by different forms of consensus and collective decision making, as opposed to different other agreements or laws that are taken in other formats. So it's bringing the discussion to this idea that we have to ask for consent from everyone. Everyone is equal in that sense, that they have the right to be asked. They have the right to say no. And so they have to be asked, can I use this? Is it okay to commercialize something that is important to you? And it's important to have conversations about how can we recognize, give acknowledgement Everyone should be recognized, every contribution should be recognized, and there are forms of doing that. There's also important to have discussions on what is compensation, what is value, and what is compensation. And compensation is not always monetary, and it's not always monetary in our ecosystem. We talk so much with our core team, right? We do all this work and we are not monetarily compensated at the value of what we do, but we are applying the 3 C's to us as well, to understand how we can work with other stakeholders in creating a system that is benefiting for all. So if we stop doing what we're doing, this will be a disadvantage for the whole ecosystem, and there will be forms of benefit, and there are, right? We have the knowledge and expertise of people like Bandana, of people like Anna, people like you who support us. This is value in our ecosystem, and it is a form of compensation. So we're starting to, create these dialogues, and we're bringing these dialogues in the UN fora as well. And there we have observer status for the Convention on Biological Diversity. And we are there to support with our expertise and with our know-how and with whatever we do well, the indigenous peoples, ethnic groups, and local communities. But we are also there to open up dialogues with fashion industry stakeholders that are currently not considering these aspects deeply in those fora. So it's a lot now about, how do we offset? Well, offsetting is not helping in any way the communities in Ladakh, obviously, because you're offsetting something that happens there or an impact that you have there in a different place. So we have to be critical about many of these tools that are out there, and they're being created under the big topic of mitigating climate change and other such critical topics at the moment. But it's important to understand that communities and the way they organize, the very simple rules that applied. I moved back to the village house here it's called Petrani. It's maybe the first time it's actually pronounced in an international panel. So I'm here in Petrani, Bihor County, Romania, in the house that my great-grandfather's grandmother and grandfather built, and where my grandmother was born. And I'm reconnecting with the community and learning the ways of being in a community. We're very few young people here, almost no young people that actually still live here. And that is also a big challenge. And kind of tracing back and bringing those discussions about the UN to this community is also an important way that we connect with the UN organizations as well, because a big mandate for the 2030 vision, 2030 global biodiversity framework, and the vision for 2050 of living in harmony with nature, which is what the Convention on Biological Diversity and the parties have agreed that we're working towards. That we can only live in harmony with nature when we understand nature and all the ecosystems that need to be kept alive, and the knowledge ecosystems that are stewarded and kept alive by local communities, if we are in this part of the world where we don't have indigenous peoples per se, except for the Sami, or by ethnic groups and indigenous peoples in other geographies. These knowledge systems, these are gold. And we need to know how to value them in the first place, and respect them, and keep them alive, and contribute to that in a knowledge partnership with the communities, not necessarily in a service provision that the communities then become, subordinated. And that's basically what the theory of change making then is, in a way, in practice in our case.
Thank you. That's really interesting, because I assume it must be quite challenging to translate sometimes complex ideas in these spaces, but laying it out like as essential to achieving those objectives. With that framework, it makes a lot of sense to someone who is very objective driven. So So thank you for that. So I have a final question for everybody, and also for any participants who want to ask questions, please feel free to put them in the chat now, and we'll get to those afterwards. So I wanted to ask you all, because this is the first panel of Cultural IP Month, kind of looking forward to the month ahead, what is one thing that you would like for people to take away from this discussion or from other discussions throughout the month? And what would you like them to apply to their own work or practice, or even just their day-to-day life if they're not in this field? So I'm going to start with you, Bandana, and then Anna, and then finish with Monica.
As Monica said, and I speak about this thanks to Monica, the 3 C's is such an amazing starting point and a great space for dialogue that is not intrusive, unthreatening. It is very clear, right? There is, you have to give credit. What is the level of compensation? What is compensation? As you asked, all of the 3 C's, I find it, I mean, because we are pretty much speaking to the converted, we are on a journey together. I cannot begin to tell you how people get startled when I talk about the 3 C's, because I'm, supporting Monica on this journey too. It is unbelievable how dramatically innovative, it's something they've not heard of. I'm talking about whether they're craftspeople or people who are fashion designers living in high rises who haven't touched the ground with, with their bare feet. And they're just 3 simple things which talks about credit, compensation, consent, which is, so for me, this is what I would love to see. Just understanding this much is a huge step forward, because I've seen the best of the best not understand these 3 C's, even while they've been pillaging different cultures for their fantastic collections. So for me, that is very important. And I think this kind of dialogue that has to reach every institution, design school, that every designer must have in his or her vocabulary, that it has to be part of the curriculum. Because there is no doubt that, anything that is going to be luxurious is now looking more and more as it should, made by hand and craft-based, especially of cultures that are deep, have incredible provenance and heritage. So that means this is going to be a huge problem if it's not instilled in designers and students right away. Because inspiration, we all want to travel. Design is always about traveling all over the world. And these young, lot of designers too, I look at them and they want to go and, be with the Incas and bring something out of there. And I was like, be careful how you tread in that area. Go with consciousness. Go with the 3 C's. We all want to be inspired by different cultures. This is the first time where we are actually celebrating our indigenousness, our regionality. Words like globalization and homogenization have become like redundant and they sound awful. I don't want to be homogenized. I have a unique personality based on my culture that I want to share. So if all these thoughts and inspirations are bubbling from the sentiment of, our regionality that we are proud of, it's a humanity that is common. If we can stick to that, then I think it's imperative that we make sure that it's in their curriculum. You can't tread into other lands, and this is not about boundaries and other people's lands. I'm talking about as a human being, if you're going to go and have a narrative, we're going to do a storytelling through canvas, through cloth, it doesn't matter. Like, what kind of dignity and respect are we walking in there with, and what are we coming out of it? That has to be taught. I mean, that would be my takeaway. I hope I made some sense.
Yes, thank you so much. And it really makes me reflect on my fashion education and what was missing from that. So yeah, that gives me a lot to think about, actually. So thank you for that, Bandana. Anna, I'll move on to you, and then Monica, you can close us off.
Yeah, I would say I would love for us to be able to take these conversations into, at least for the next months, all our wine conversations with our friends that are not particularly from this bubble, because as I said previously, I think it goes way beyond and it tackles the social contract in general that we're having So I would love for us to focus on what can it bring for the future, and what is actually the contribution that and the thing that we can imagine together from the learnings in the past. And I know that the protection side and the justice side of it has to be addressed, but that I'm more certain that it will happen. So kind of imagining how can we bring everything that you're doing into the future decision making, and how would that be different, and have those type of insights, and literally active listening to your friends or parents or co-workers. What is their take on it? I think it will enrich the nodes that we're trying to weave in for the future. So that would be something like tell stories and deeply listen to the people around us, so that we can understand what's the next node we're gonna put on the carpet.
For me, as a takeaway, I think when we said that this is a gift of knowledge that we are creating for the whole community of thinkers, of change makers, of innovators, of professionals, of artisans, of craft custodians, of anyone who wants to have access. And at the moment, of course, we would love to have it in all indigenous languages, in different languages, but we don't have the resources for that. We did put our whole heart and soul into crafting a program that includes over 25 events and knowledge drops. So the April is for us not only a landmark event, but we are a team of 3 in the core team. And then we have an army of cultural sustainability change makers that are our allies and community members and people like you, right, who are allies in the panel, who are contributing to this month. And we've promised that this will be a theme of the decade. So we're 2 years in, we still have 8 to go. April, a takeaway, will always be Cultural IP Month for at least another 8 years, until we move to the next level, when we've achieved these new ways of changing policy. Hopefully by 8 years from now, we will have together as an ecosystem. So a takeaway is to map this in your calendar and start getting in touch for what we can create together, weave together for the year ahead. Second is not only the 3 C's, but it's the diversity of things that can happen under this new way of interacting, of not seeing indigenous peoples, ethnic groups, and local communities as something external to how the world, the real world, really works. Because decision makers and let's say business people at the moment, they have they control a certain part of the resources that are all around there, and I love those, and it's also now being in movies, this theme, like if you're left alone in a field, will you be able to survive? And, you know, kind of coming back for me, even for me coming back in the village house, I do have the land behind the house, but I'm not yet able to set up my own garden and know all the processes, whilst my neighbors, they do. And they come to me, I share some of the knowledge that I have. They give me a few eggs, they give me some milk. So we're exchanging, because we're starting to understand that this is a reality and it could happen. And not that I didn't value their contributions, but being here, I started to realize more and more what a wealth of knowledge this is, and how it's being we've been brainwashed in my youth as well, as a child, to go and want things from the supermarket. But when I taste the tomatoes here, the fresh onion that I just got yesterday, it's already fresh onion from the garden, from the neighbor. It was like, this is the taste of onion. This is a real taste of onion. And the main takeaway was not the onion, but the leaving you know, the depth of, and the heaviness of everything aside. We need to have fun in the process, and we need to connect on a social level as well. We are humans, and we are here in this space. We are in a most vulnerable space. It's a thing that we always discuss with the team. We are so emotionally connected and invested, this is not business as usual. So here's a space to be vulnerable, like Anna says, and to come and weave relationships, sisterhoods, brotherhoods, community, even if it's online. And I'm so happy to see amongst the participants also people that have been growing together with us in this community, and whom you'll be seeing in other panels this month. So takeaway, stay with us, stay with us, and stay and remember, Cultural IP Month is about the story of humanity, like Anna was saying.
Thank you so much, Monica. And I love also thinking about, going back to basics of the garden and growing food, and remembering that actually, the systems in which we make clothing, a lot of us in the West especially are very separate from, but really it's about the resources that the earth provides and the skills that people have developed over generations. So thank you so much for that.